Welcome to a webinar on dismantling anti-blackness in South Asia and diaspora as part of a series of intellectual interventions for the Black Story Project, a virtual interactive exhibition to examine, explore, and embrace the historical ties between Black and South Asian communities. I am Nahar Khan, and I thank you for joining us today. We'll be in conversation with Dr. Haider Ali Khan, a John Evans Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Economics at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at University of Denver. Dr. Khan's work ranges from modeling complex economic systems, taking into account race, gender, and social stratification, to the political and economic theories of racism, democracy, and justice. He is also an award-winning poet, translator, and literary and art critic. He has written on Rabindranath Tagore, Qazi Nazrul Islam, Shamsur Rahman, Mirza Ghalib, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Pablo Picasso, Surrealism, Asian and Islamic art, and the Japanese haiku master Basho, to name a few. Dr. Khan, I thank you for being here with us today, and I look forward to our discussions on deconstructing the ties between Black and South Asian communities. Let me start with my first question on relating to the American framework. Historically speaking, if we look at the events between the 1880s and 1900s, an era of intense anti-Asian sentiment in America, there were multiple waves of Bengali Muslim migrants, primarily those from Bangladesh, that jumped ships and started to form communities of color by marrying and starting families with Black, Puerto Rican, and Creole women in places like New York, New Orleans, and Detroit. What do you think enabled the forging of lives between the Black Americans and Bengali migrants?
Excellent question. I think this is a rather recent angle, and we have to thank Professor Vivek Bald from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Media Studies, for writing a great book on Bengali Harlem. Our viewers probably know that Harlem is a part of New York City. It's far from Midtown and historically has been a place for African Americans and other minorities as well. And in the 1920s, there was something that is very famous in American cultural history. It's called Harlem Renaissance. There was a cultural flourishing in Harlem. But what Professor Balt has done is to draw our attention to precisely the angle that you mentioned. The migrants from South Asia, particularly Bangladesh, and particularly some specific districts of Bangladesh, like Sylhet, Noakhali, Chittagong, and also some others. Some of them had to overcome their own racism towards African Americans in America, and they found support, forged very solid relationships, quite often matrimonial relationships, especially African American women and Puerto Rican women. I personally experienced some of this when I first came to this country. I actually knew the owner of a restaurant in Manhattan Theater District, and his wife was a Puerto Rican lady, whom I also got to know rather well.
The civil rights movement by Black Americans in fighting for social justice was a time when segregation was very much in place and Jim Crow laws were heavily enforced. Neighborhoods, schools, facilities were all segregated. Interracial marriage was illegal, and Black folks didn't even have the right to vote. Much of the peaceful movement that was led by Dr. Martin Luther King, like March on Washington, advised by Bayard Rustin. What role did the civil rights movement play in South Asians being able to migrate to the US? And what are some of the connections that we see between the Black freedom movement and India's independence movement?
Well, that's a question on which actually we could spend quite a bit of time. To answer briefly is almost impossible, but I will try. First of all, I think South Asians today and other immigrants from Asia, immigrants of color in general, should be immensely grateful to the civil rights movement, especially during the 1960s, which coincided with the relaxation of immigration policies towards non-whites in general and Asians in particular. So that's one part of the story. But the longer part of the story is, as you pointed out, the historic struggle that started even before U.S. became independent, but certainly in the post-Civil War period, from 1870s onwards, racism actually became more intense in the U.S., in the South in particular. Although legally there was equality, but in reality, there was tremendous inequality, and that was reinforced. Professor Bald has also drawn our attention to one particular immigrant from South Asia. His name actually coincides partly with mine. His full name is Dada Amir Haider Khan. And Dada Amir Haider Khan jumped ship in 1918 and spent quite a few years in the US, going through, starting in New York, and then going through the Midwest and visiting various parts of the US and staying there for some time. And unlike many others who came, but they were largely illiterate and could not really leave any written document, Amir Haider Khan was literate and even literary, you might say. He wrote. Later, he got into British jail because of his politics in the 1930s. From 1939 to 1942, he was in a British jail in India. And he wrote his autobiography then called Losing the Chains. And later, it became 2 volumes because he lived till, I think, late 1980s. I met him several times, both when I was a boy in school and also later when I became a professor and visited his home then was in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and he would come to Lahore quite frequently. But what is significant about Dada Amir Haider Khan, among other things, is that he evolved. He was also a racist person towards non-whites, and he gradually realized how racist he was. And he very honestly describes his progress and his great debt to the Black activists, the African-American activists in early 1920s, whom he met, particularly in Detroit, Michigan, and he participated in the labor movement as well. So this is a fascinating story, and I would ask our viewers to dig up, his 2-volume autobiography published from Pakistan in 2007. It's really an amazing story and told very well.
I think that's a fascinating story, and I think it's so important for our communities to decolonize our minds and really unlearn the implicit biases that are kind of conditioned within us. And I also have to agree, I think the civil rights movement really made way for the historic victories that were to come for minorities in America. And South Asians directly benefited from the civil rights movement in the 60s and the Nationality Act of 65. What's also interesting is the interconnectedness of the Black freedom movement and the Indian independence movement. It's fascinating that an individual like Bayard Rustin, who taught Martin Luther King about Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance and advised him on the tactics of civil disobedience. And this form of peaceful protest is highly reflected, strongly reflected in the boycott of segregated buses in Montgomery in 56 and the March on Washington as well in 63, where King delivered his legendary "I Have a Dream" speech, which brings me to the model minority myth, which has been so prevalent and has created a deep racial wedge within BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Your thoughts on this, Dr. Khan?
Well, again, it's a very profound question. Thank you for pointing out the antecedents to Dr. Martin Luther King's own nonviolent movement. One of my mentors in America who worked with Dr. King, late Professor Vincent Harding, who, by the way, has published a lot on Martin Luther King and nonviolence, and another friend, Professor Sudarshan Kapur, who has published on Gandhi and Martin Luther King, would be very good sources for those who are interested on this issue. I think the model minority myth, and it is indeed a myth, because it papers over the more rebellious minority groups and in fact maligns them and impugns them, brands them as being not fitting into American society, not willing to be quiet and try to get whatever they could get from within the system. The model minority myth served and still serves a purpose in keeping people quiet, people who might otherwise be quite rebellious. And it applies in particular to Asian Americans, not just South Asians, but also to the Japanese Americans, to Chinese Americans, to Korean Americans, to Americans who come from Southeast Asia. And indeed, this is a vicious myth, and it needs to be understood and analyzed for what it really is. It's an ideological ploy to keep people subjugated and under submission.
Absolutely. I think, sometimes we don't realize or connect that in 65, when the US passed the Immigration Act, where Asians were only allowed to immigrate based on high education levels or special skills. So it's almost as if we were predetermined to be successful, law-abiding, and good, and essentially model minorities, and the polar opposite of Black people and Black communities. But we don't connect that Black Americans were not introduced to the country based on education. They were enslaved. They were systematically dehumanized and oppressed. And so I have to agree. I think the model minority myth was a tool to divide people of color by giving us partial access to rights, healthcare, education, employment, and it almost created a feeling of false rivalry between minorities. But prior to that, there was a strong sense of solidarity between the two communities in the West. During when there were deep anti-Asian sentiments, these two communities interconnected through intermarriage, as we spoke, the forging of lives and forming communities of color throughout working class America. Why is this inter-minority solidarity important in your opinion?
Well, I think it's definitely something that people have analyzed, starting with pioneers among the African American community. We now have the concept of intersectionality, which brings together ideas of class, which you mentioned with respect to the more elite class immigrants from South Asia, and gender. And these are all very deep issues, as well as race. We know that race is fictitious, but racism is unfortunately altogether too real. If we take this intersectional perspective, we find that the poorer, working class, blue collar especially, low income type of people, and more recently women, they are discriminated against as a group more. And here in this country, because of history of racism, the racism against Blacks and Puerto Ricans in particular, and you can add Mexicans, in this group, basically Spanish-speaking groups. And although there's been tremendous genocide, there are still some Native Americans left, and they have been discriminated against perhaps the longest, which still continues. So this separation of minorities in terms of basically class, really, but also racism, implicit and explicit, especially among East Asians, South Asians, very pervasive. I listened to a talk by a very amazing, intelligent and articulate student of Indian origin who lives in Scotland. It was delightful to listen to her Scottish accented lecture on racism and how deeply embedded it is in India, which also relates to subtle differences of color, which is quite amazing to everybody and laughable for most white people, really, except when they're trying to use it cynically. for their own purposes.
Absolutely. I think, these notions really do uphold a status quo and a system that only benefits some over others. That leads me to our current day situation where South Asians, as South Asians, we carry and much of the time perpetuate anti-blackness and anti-black sentiments. Where does this stem from, and how can we disrupt and dismantle binary conceptions of homeland and diaspora?
That's a very good question. In many ways, racism in a broad sense, discriminating against, looking down upon people who are of slightly different shades of color or differentiated in some physiognomic aspect, hair or shape of their face, you name it, and even minor differences can be accentuated very intensely if it serves some purpose, for people who are in charge, who are in the dominant position. And racism is pretty much like that in India, in South Asia. It goes back actually to old days of caste system among the Hindus. Muslims were not supposed to have caste system. The Sikhs, who now mostly live in India, although there's a large diasporic community, they were not supposed to have this caste system, and they don't. On the other hand, there was the distinction between Ashraf and Atraf, the people who were upper class, people who were lower class. And part of the distinction was also in terms of skin tone and skin color. So it really predates the Europeans coming to the subcontinent. But once they found themselves in the ruling position, these Europeans, especially the English, they knew that this was a very good weapon to use. So they accentuated even more some of these differences and defined some people as, for example, the Punjabis as being martial, and they classified Bengalis as being non-martial. The fact, if you look at history, is that the Bengalis were the first rebellious group of people. So it cuts in many ways. But coming back to the race question, it is basically accentuation of skin color and some physical features over others, and making one group look superior. And in fact, once they start believing this, then you don't have to work very hard to keep this division going.
Absolutely. I think I have to agree. I think there are definitely some roots embedded in colonialism, and I think it really brings to light how we must question ideas and impacts left by colonialism, whether it's economic exploitations, ethnic rivalries, human rights violation, and really challenge that sense of hegemonic power. And Dr. Khan, you mentioned racism and colorism. I think I also have to agree with that. Even looking at the entertainment industry within South Asia, where colorism is heavily perpetuated and practiced through skin lightening and certain projections of standards of beauty. I mean, I think inclusivity becomes an extremely important aspect of industries like that. And thankfully, colorism has started to enter the fore in South Asian public discourse. What are your thoughts on the presence and perpetuation of colorism within South Asian communities?
I think it is a vicious kind of circle that will reinforce itself unless strong opposition at various levels is offered. And what we are doing today, for example, is to offer some light in terms of historical analysis and sociological and economic analysis. You'll find that, again, this is a subject on which we could have a long conversation. The history of Bollywood is very, very interesting because although this colorism was always there were many actors and actresses who are not really that fair in what I call the pioneering and more progressive days, starting in 1930s, then 1940s, 1950s, especially 1950s, when there were a lot of progressive so-called social films being made. If you look at a movie like Mother India, which was nominated for Oscar, the first Indian film, the producer was Mehboob Khan. And he produced a lot of other films like that. And the heroes and heroines were not necessarily very fair. Some of them were, but they were people with strong personalities, even women, especially in Mother India. Nargis, the leading person, is a tremendously strong character. And she comes from a poor background. So poor that she herself had to carry the plow to till their lands, which is a very famous scene from that film. In the 60s and 70s, in 70s especially, there was a progressive movement where Smita Patil, who is not very fair, she played roles in very progressive films. And then we have the 80s, 90s, and things do get worse. And I think people who are not familiar with the entire history of the film industry in India might very easily think that that's the way it has always been. To some extent, that's true. But as I just pointed out, there has been oppositional forces, very creative oppositional forces. But today, I think it looks bleak, and people have to speak out, and people have to create an alternative film and media presence. I think that's very, very important. And I would focus on that really to break through this vicious circle that we see today.
Absolutely, Dr. Khan. I think it becomes so crucial and important to challenge issues of caste and colorism and shadeism, and realize that this form of discrimination that treats people of lighter skin as superior and assigns more value over those that are darker within the same race is really counterproductive to the entire BIPOC community. Moving towards where one must stand in allyship around issues of race and power, Ibram X. Kendi makes a distinction between anti-racist and non-racist. Do you believe it's enough to be non-racist?
He means by anti-racist somebody who gets involved in the struggle. And I think that's a good thing if one can. I would think that you would need a critical mass of anti-racist people who are also broadly aware of different dimensions of racism and the need for fighting in different manner at different times in different circumstances, all the way from economic discrimination and political discrimination and social discrimination to cultural expressions of racism, because human beings live as part of a totality, which anthropologists call culture. But in this totality, there are many different parts, and we have to figure out what kind of anti-racist movement, using that term for the time being, will be necessary at what point, and what kind of also cross-race alliances we must make. Anti-racists cannot win unless they make cross-race alliances with the proper kind of allies who are also anti-racists in this sense. So we need to look for bridges as well.
Many believe that James Baldwin was the most important Black thinker of the era when you first arrived in America. Did his work influence you? If so, how?
Well, I have many memories of James Baldwin, or as he asked me to, and I complied very happily to call him Jimmy. I met him, actually, I read him long before I had met him, but I met him by coincidence. A part of my life that I haven't written about, I haven't written about many parts of my life, is when I spent time in Greenwich Village in New York City, and then in Paris. In Paris in particular, I studied with some great philosophers, Alain Badiou and Gilles Deleuze, among others. And I sang. I made my living by singing, and I lived in a commune, really very egalitarian group of idealistic people, who thought we should live together and experience sharing and caring for each other. So I used to sing on the right bank because that's where the money was, and then bring the money to the left bank and made sure that we all survived. And one night he came to the place where I was singing. It was a more progressive place. And I sang, I remember, among other things, Mona Lisa, which is a great song made famous actually by Nat King Cole, the great African-American singer. And after that, he was very kind. He came and said it was really very moving for him. And I was really floored. And then he very kindly invited me to come visit him in south of France, in the little village in the Provence where he lived. And I spent some more time with him talking and felt that it was a genuine invitation. And I met many other luminaries there, many jazz musicians, singers, writers, painters. His house was kind of a commune by itself. People came and went, and the conversations were lively, lots of creative artists. So the part of Baldwin that I think people need to understand better is that he wanted everybody to be creative. And he realized, sadly for himself and for others like him, that during that time in America of the 40s and 50s and 60s even, it was not possible for creative Black artists, thinkers, painters, poets to be in America. And that's why many of them ended up in France, in particular in Paris, which was more open than many other parts of the world. And they did create great things there.
Oh, that's a fascinating experience. And thank you, Dr. Khan, for sharing that with us. What does the unique story of Madam Vice President Kamala Harris mean for the Black and Brown communities, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a great story, and the story of her mother and her father are also equally interesting. I have been very lucky because I learned from her father, Professor Don Harris, who was a prolific and deep thinker, still is. And I think Kamala Harris learned from her surroundings, and she represents in some ways what Melville in the 19th century expressed for America, that if you cut any one of us, in our blood, you will find the entire world, the whole human race. Melville was a great democratic person, just as Walt Whitman was in the 19th century. And Kamala Harris combines so much just in her genome, I suppose, combining South Asia with Caribbean and the American experience, growing up in California, in Northern California, and becoming a professional, very successful professional in her own rights, and being very brave in so many ways. I think she's a great role model for people. I think she is inspiring, especially minority women, but also men, like me. I think we should really look at the positive side of her example and learn from it. And maybe next generation of activists will do it even better. I certainly hope that the next generation of activists and activist scholars in particular will do it better than my generation has done so far.
Absolutely. And I think the hope is that it does get better with every passing generation. I think it's also really positively impactful on children, because I really feel that representation matters. On a personal level, I think growing up in South Asia, that wasn't something that I was exposed to. Seeing characters that look like me in books, in illustrations, in even TV, that was something that wasn't commonplace. So I think even for children, boys and girls alike, I think seeing representation and seeing somebody that looks like you is extremely, extremely important.
Indeed.
Dr. Khan, you've written at length about the polyphonic anti-racist and anti-imperialist poetics of Qazi Nazrul Islam in a fascinating piece for Alal Odulal. Could you recount some of it here? I'm sure our audience would enjoy it.
Well, just briefly and quickly, I've always been actually influenced, we might say, by Nazrul, and he was a polymath, and he struggled against tremendous odds to become what he became. The piece is available online, so perhaps can share the link with people. But my basic take on Nazrul in terms of his poetics, the aspects of his poetry, both in terms of form and in terms of content, is that it came from deep within the tradition of the oppressed and rebellious people. And it had a message of harmony among those people and a message of resistance against those who were their oppressors, no matter what their color was, you know, where they originated from. But clearly, in his lifetime, the English who ruled India, they were the main target. But he also was against oppressors from within Hindus and from within Muslims and from within other groups as well. And he has a really very moving poem. All his poems are very moving in different ways. But this poem is called Amar Koifiyat, which means my defense or my explanation. And there he basically tells the reader how Hindus are against him because they think he's too much of a Muslim. Muslims are against him because they think he's too much for Hindus, and so on and so forth. So and so it's quite humorous. But at the end he says that I really don't want to be a timeless, ageless, eternal poet. I do not really care, he says very plainly. But what I do know that, and what I fervently wish for is that once all these things are over, then there will be newer generations who will build anew, who will be truly creative, who will be truly living in a society fit for human beings. Anything that spreads the message, anything that makes people feel more deeply, think more reflectively, and act more boldly, I think is worth getting involved in.
Dr. Khan, you have written a very powerful poem titled 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I'd like to request you to please recite the poem.
Well, thank you, Nahar. It would be my pleasure. Although it is a sad poem, it ends optimistically. And it begins with a quote from D.H. Lawrence. So let me read that quote first before I recite the poem. Ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to take it tragically. This is a line, perhaps the beginning of D.H. Lawrence's famous novel, revolutionary novel, in fact, Lady Chatterley's Lover. And here is the poem, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. All clocks on our sorry planet stopped that day after 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Public memory is so sedulously short. We live by cliches of the moment. Sounds of Dixie on the radio, officials' voices crackle over the airwaves. So many lives lost. Color line, still alive. A dove above cries in vain, rain and blood dripping. What really happens in the barren landscape we call the heart after love dies? Who can tell? Are we made of broken dreams only? Or do we dare to dream of a new beginning, soulful future beyond color line? Cold geraniums on windowsill still radiate a beauty, singular summer colors. I remember the voice of my poet teacher of negritude. Our work is only just beginning, and it remains to conquer all the violence residing in the recesses of our passion, and no race has a monopoly on beauty, intelligence, or strength, and there is a place for all at the rendezvous of victory. So we wait together. So many desiccated, delicate sunflowers waiting for drops of generous sunshine. Only 8 minutes and 19 seconds to reach us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan, for sharing your deep insight in deconstructing the ties between the two communities. Your commitment to continuing your commendable efforts is inspiring. I think it's absolutely crucial to question our own implicit biases, question our own sense of brown fragility, and the interpolation of certain roles that society has created for us or even assigned to us by culture. Looking back at the historical solidarity the Black and Brown communities shared in the West, they spent decades forging lives across the kinds of ethnic, cultural, and religious differences that are too often presumed to be impossible or insurmountable. I think that says something important today when South Asian communities, more often than not, set themselves apart from African American, Puerto Rican, and other communities of color. And so the hope is that our historical ties and interconnectedness can be reflected in societies and communities today through interminority solidarity and allyship. Over the course of the next several weeks, in addition to the virtual exhibition, there will be a series of webinars, interviews, art talk, text and video content and resources to spark meaningful dialogue around issues of race, identity, and power. To stay updated on the events to come, please sign up for our e-newsletter on www.theblackstory.com. Proceeds from the Black Story Project will go towards BIPOC CA, Black and Indigenous People of Color Creative Association. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll tune in for our upcoming webinars.
I was born by the river in a little tent, and oh, just like that river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will.